Hello, guys. It's good to have all of you here. And I've got a very special guest joining me tonight, Ernst Roets, the Vice CEO of Afriforum. And we are talking about the list that Afriforum has recently released of, I believe, 195 farms, which Afriforum says the government is targeting for expropriation without compensation. Hello, Ernst. How are you?
Hello, Willem. Thank you very much. I'm very well, and yourself?
Good, thanks. So, Ernst, tell me about this list. You can obviously not tell me exactly where you got it, but can you give us a hint of how you got a hold of it, or from whom you got it?
Yes. So the list was received through obviously through a confidential source, which we aren't able to disclose. So we need to do a balancing act at the moment between providing the information and providing as much information as we can, but also doing it in such a way so that we don't expose how we got the list. And this is very important for us because as a civil rights organization, we regularly get approached by whistleblowers and people who share important confidential information with us about corruption or about information that might be relevant for private prosecution and so forth. And we also need to send a message, a very strong message, that when we get information through a credible and a confidential source, that we will do everything that is necessary to protect that source. So the list, what I can say about the list is it is definitely being circulated within the Department of Land Reform. There is no doubt about
You guys
that.
are 100% confident this is the real thing.
Well, we aren't 100% confident that this is the list that has been approved of farms that they would be targeting. We are 100% confident that this list is being distributed in the department, and we are 100% confident that this list deals with farms that have been identified for expropriation. Now, it might be that they were identified by someone who's submitting a proposal. It might be a discussion document. It might be that people were compiling lists so that they can put everything together and then decide which they would target or which they wouldn't target. Of the status of the documents, we aren't 100% sure, but there are two things of which we are 100% sure. This list deals with farms that is supposedly in some form identified for expropriation, and also this list is being circulated in the Department of Land Reform.
It's very odd. The first two farms on the list, I got the information that they are not, they do not belong to a commercial farmer. They actually belong to a company, and that recently they have found I think you call it a coal rig on the farm that they want to put on a coal mine on there. Can you tell us how many of the farms are actually commercial farmers that have contacted you, and how many of them are actually really farms that can be used to put mines up on?
Yes. We don't have that information yet because we are calling every single one that have contacted us in some way. So we are going through the information, and hopefully, I thought that by today we would have all that information. But to give you an idea, by Monday morning when we arrived at the office, we had 600 emails that we received through the website onteiening.co.za. So and also many of the people, so we found that many of the people have sent us emails who aren't on that list or who simply had questions about that list, and that's fine, and we want to talk with all of them. But also some of the people have a lot to say and they have a lot of questions. So it's not the type of telephone conversation where you can say to the person, listen, I only have 1 minute to talk to you. So the point that I'm making is it takes quite some time to go through because we are calling them one by one. We thought that having one person on a full-time basis, we would be able to do all of the phone calls in one day. That certainly wasn't, that didn't happen. So what happened this morning was we had people in a call center whom we tasked with calling everyone on the list and then to categorize them. And then the people whose properties are clearly on the list, we will then follow up with them on an individual basis. So long story short, it takes us a lot more time to go through getting in touch with the people one by one. Then I initially thought we will go through them one by one. We will speak with everyone over the telephone. But unfortunately, it takes a bit longer than I anticipated to gather all the information and to be able, for example, to draw up statistics about the list.
Okay, and the people who are definitely on the list, whose properties are definitely on the list, how do they react, and what is Afriforum going to do to assist them?
Yes, well, they are obviously furious about the fact that their property is on the list, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them were completely surprised or completely shocked to see their property on the list. They didn't expect this at all. And what many of them have been telling us is that they don't have any history of land claims on their properties, so they don't know how they could be on this list. I do think, however, and we've spoken to many people in the last 2 days, and I know there's been some criticism about the publication of the list, but I can say to you that the overwhelming majority are very grateful for the fact that we have published the list, so that there can at least be a little bit more certainty about what the situation is at the moment.
Well, I could imagine that they are furious that their farms are on the list, and you said that almost none of them had any previous claims or land claims on their farms, which is quite significant to me, because isn't it true that all the land claims are finished processing, or is that not true yet?
Yes, well, firstly, it's not all of them that have no claims on the farms. There are some of them that clearly do. So I've spoken with some people whose farms have been identified, and they expected their farms to be there because they know the history of that farm. So they know there's been an issue with government, and they know that there's been some communications to and fro, and there's been issues about land claims, and they expected they would be on the list. But then there were a lot who were completely surprised. So yeah, it's not all of them, but certainly a large chunk of them have no history of land claims.
And how many of the farms that you have identified had minerals on them, like the coal mine on those two farms there in Limpopo, for example?
I know about those two farms. I don't know what the total is, unfortunately. It seems like there are a few such farms where there are minerals involved. Some of the farms have other issues as well. Like the one that's a bit strange is in the Letsetele Valley. There's a farm there that there's been a debate with government about government wanting to get that land so that they can build a dam, but there's no water there. So it's very strange. The people in the area there, they cannot understand why government is trying to, or at least says that they want to build a dam in that particular area, because it doesn't make sense. So that's their argument. So they've been wanting to buy the land for some time, and they just couldn't get the funds together to buy the land. And now suddenly that's on the list under the heading Proposed Expropriation Test Cases.
Yeah, it's quite funny. Some of the farms that I've investigated, for example, the first two on that list, and some others, another factor that's quite common in these farms are many of those who aren't farms that are commercial farmers or Chinese investors who invest in these farms. Have you also picked up a link there or
yes,
a pattern there?
It's too early to say that there's a pattern, but I have picked that up. That there are issues with it. It becomes more complicated when you bear in mind that it's not as simple as simply individuals owning property. So there are companies and there are trusts and investors and that type of thing. So it's hard at this stage to make broad conclusions about the list, about what is on the list. What we do know, and I think this is important. So there's been questions about the authenticity of the list, and what we did, we also gave a copy of we had a discussion with TAU SA, the Agricultural Union, and we gave them a copy of the document. Obviously, the document that we received had a lot more information than the one that was published. We didn't publish everything, and among others, there were, in many of the cases, there were the values of the properties were on there, what the farmers want for the properties, what they believe, what the valuer general valued the properties for. And so TAU SA also took the list and they verified a bunch of those farms. And the details on this list was very accurate in terms of, for example, what the valuation of the property is and so forth. So that really convinced them that this list is authentic. I mean, that's not information that any member of the public can get. You might know the value of one or two farms because you know the people, but it's not possible for a member of the public to draw up a list with 190 properties or 195, depending on how you count them, with the values of the property and the history of the property and what the state is prepared or was prepared to pay for the properties, or at least what the valuer general valued the properties for. All of that information is on the list. We didn't publish all of that just for privacy reasons, but that just confirms that someone who has inside information was involved with the drafting of this document.
Well, that's very troubling to me. I'm quite scared of what might happen next. What do you think, Ernst? What's the government going to do in the expropriation? Are they going to try use the courts, or do you think they're just going to use the ANC Red Army to come and take them?
Yeah. I think at this stage it's a shotgun tactic. So they seem to be doing everything, or want to do everything, or try everything. And I think the ANC is like a wounded buffalo at this stage. It's very weak, and as a result thereof, it's more dangerous than it has ever been. So if you want to know what they want to do, there's the famous story about Chamberlain coming back after speaking with Adolf Hitler, and what he said and what Churchill said. And Chamberlain thought, wow, no, Hitler is someone that we can reason with. And Churchill came back and he said, this man is a psychopath. And then they asked they asked Churchill afterwards, how did you know that Hitler, how were you able to predict what Hitler would do? And he said, because I read what he said and I believed him. And I think it's the same with the ANC government. You have to listen. You can read what they say, and they've been contradicting themselves so many times. So, for example, the Minister of Land Reform has said publicly at a press conference that they cannot wait for the process to change the constitution. They cannot wait. They have to do this themselves. And then she said they have identified the properties, and they are going to continue with that, with the expropriation of these properties without changing the constitution, or at least they are going to try. And she then went even further, and that's, I think, the most horrific thing is she then said that we have identified the properties, but we do not want the owners to know, because if they know that we have identified their properties, then they would start preparing for a legal challenge, and we don't want them to do that.
I don't understand why she would say that in the first place, because if she does not want the owners to know that their farms are in the list, why in the first place did she go out and say we identified some farms? I can't understand the logic behind that, because if I was the government, I would just keep all of this a secret.
Yeah, I think they're trying to have their bread buttered on both sides. So they want to do this secretly, but they want their supporters to know that they are doing this secretly. I think that's what they are doing. And so the minister has herself, and the ANC, Zizi Kodwa and Ronald Lamola and the head of department, they've all said that they have a list. Now, then afterwards, so initially they said that we have a list, we know which properties we are going to take, and we have identified them, but we don't want those people to know because we don't want them to prepare. I think she said it's going to put a spanner in her wheel, and she doesn't want unnecessary trouble. So she just don't want them to know. She just wants to expropriate their property, and then one day they wake up and it's not theirs anymore.
Well, they have caused some unnecessary trouble, to use her own words, already by just saying that in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. But so then after she said that, the government, the ANC at least, the National Executive Council of the ANC came out and they said that there is a list and there are 139 properties on that list. And by the way, it might be 139 cases, not necessarily 139 properties. And why that is relevant is that might explain why the list that we have has 190 on. So by the way, the total on the list is 195, but there are 5 cases that are doubles. So if you take out the doubles, the total is 190. So that might explain, because not all of those farms were listed individually. They were listed as cases. And I can't remember the total cases on our list. It was much fewer. It was 140 something, if I recall. So they might have meant 139 cases, and that explains why the amount of farms is more than 139. I know people have been asking about this.
Okay. What do you think about the fact that people, especially there from News 24, I've seen Adrian Basson, he's saying you guys are fearmongers and you're trying to cause a massive stir just to get more money from the public.
Yeah, that's very, very funny. So I think Chris Chameleon made a tweet about this. Basically what's happening is the ANC is saying, we are going to take your property. Then we say the ANC are going to take our property. Then the editor of News 24 says, you guys are a bunch of fearmongers for saying that. And that's the situation in South Africa. And I know Adrian has been getting some flack for his clearly contradictory statements. So he very viciously attacked Afriforum when we went to the United States to gain support against expropriation without compensation, for being alarmist and for saying South Africa is going to be the next Zimbabwe, which we didn't say. And then just the other day, he said, no, he cannot, I can't remember his words. He basically said that he cannot with confidence say to people that we are not going to be the next Zimbabwe. So I'm still waiting for the apology from Adrian, but I'm sure we wouldn't get that. But I think the point there in terms of, and it's again, I think I've said this before when me and you spoke, that the vast majority of journalists out there are hardworking, I think ethical people with integrity. I think the majority really are, but there are some who are clearly ideologues, who are clearly driving particular agendas, who make no secret of the fact that they regard some people as heroes and they regard some people as villains simply based on their ideas. And what these people are trying to do is trying to convince us that they are just neutral, objective journalists, and
that's totally
just not sustainable.
Laughable, actually. I have to talk about this. Prof. David Bullard actually had quite a funny tweet there where he said, "Isn't it funny how all journalists nowadays are not journalists anymore, but social justice warriors, and all of them belong to some LGBTQI," and then he just typed a lot of other letters by tribe there. So that was quite funny. I enjoyed that. He's quite In any case, it's quite funny to me also how the news are actually, or how the news companies are actually trying to protect the ANC, even though the ANC are still trying to do something completely communist. But what we haven't got to, Ernst, do you have any intelligence on what tactics the ANC might use if the farmer just persists and says he will never leave his farm, or he just stays there, and how are they going to forcefully remove him out? What are they going to do, and what are you guys going to do in such a case?
Yes, so the problem that the ANC has is that it is so drunk on its own ideology that I'm sure there's an element of maliciousness in this, but they are so convinced that what they are doing is the right thing to do. And it's either because they think it will work, or I think maybe more probable is that it's just more important for them to hurt white people than it is to help black people. So they don't care or the gratification they would get from expropriation without compensation, knowing that they will take some white people's as properties. That outweighs the fact that black people will be poor and will be starving.
But are they really more focused on taking white people's property and hurting white people, or are they more focused on going through with the communist narrative that the ANC is always going through with the ideology? I mean, I've watched Tainted Heroes that you guys made, and it's quite clear that they are a communist organization and they want to collectivize farms because that is the communist ideology. Yes. Don't you think they are ideologically driven most of the time?
I think it's mostly ideologically driven. I think it's so ideologically driven that they don't even know it's ideologically driven. So you would speak to members of the ANC who, if you ask them questions, you would find out that they haven't read the Communist Manifesto, but they quote the Communist Manifesto thinking that it's their own words. So it's become their own. It's sort of taken over their own thought processes. The terminology is part of their own. They think it's their own thoughts, but it's really stuff that's been written in Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto.
And it's really stuff that has been written in their heads while they were trained by the USSR, I would say.
Yeah. So I think Tainted Hero is a 2-hour-long documentary, but I think probably for the purpose of our conversation, I think one of the most important points there is it's a documentary about the history of the ANC and how the ANC came to power, especially the untold story. But I think the most important aspect for purpose of this conversation is that in 1979, we know in the 1970s already, before the Soweto uprisings, the ANC was backed by the Soviet Union, who thought that the ANC has the biggest chance of becoming, of being sort of the champion of black people, or the anti-apartheid movement. And the Soviet Union at that stage had this project of world revolution. They wanted to change the world, to dominate the world and to expand the Soviet Union. And they thought the ANC was the best unit to do that, or proxy, in South Africa. So what happened then was the Soweto uprisings, which was led by the Black Consciousness Movement, which had nothing to do with the ANC. And they completely took over the initiative from the ANC, the Black Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement and ZAPU, and to an extent Inkatha as well at the time. Then they were in trouble with the Soviet Union masters, who then said, "No, listen, we need to train you to further this revolution." And what they then did was they sent them to Vietnam. They sent a senior delegation of the ANC, which included Thabo Mbeki and I think Joe Slovo and Chris Hani. I can't remember the others. So they sent them to Vietnam to get taught from the Vietnamese how they fought the Americans and the French. And they were then taught a strategy that was developed by Mao Zedong, which is called the People's War. And this is all written up in the ANC's own history documents. So, and the People's War basically amounts to what the ANC did in the townships. It's about regarding people as pawns and
actually it's extreme fear mongering. Exactly what you guys are being accused of. They're in the extreme, because you guys are saying, well, they're going to take your property, and what the ANC said was, if you don't support us, we are going to burn you alive in such a way that it's the most painful way possible.
It's exactly, and that's, by the way, that's why it's called a People's War, because the war is being fought with people in the sense that people are the ammunition, and ammunition is expendable. And that's what Mao Zedong did with the Korean War and the Vietnam War.
I think our method of necklacing is probably one of the most painful and brutal ways of killing a person. Just for international people who don't know what that is, what they do is, usually when you burn someone at the stake or so forth, what happened was he died of one of two ways. Usually, if the fire was quite big, he would die of poisoning from the carbon monoxide before he would actually burn to death. And if the fire was quite small, the person would actually die of dehydration. But what the necklacing did was, they would put a tire around your body, make it full of petrol, and set it alight, so you can run around and breathe oxygen, fresh oxygen in, because you can run around while you're burning alive. So they actually made sure that you die at the slowest way possible, burning alive, and that's the tactics they used in the People's War.
Yeah, and then there was another dimension of it, which was a religious dimension, in the sense that there was a belief at the time, and I'm not sure if it's still a belief, that if you burn to death, then your soul burns to death as well, and you do not get to reach the Creator. But so the point I wanted to make, just to pull this story through, is, so that's what was happening in South Africa. And then there was a very important thing, just to pull this back to expropriation without compensation and this current strategy. So the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, which was regarded as the fall of communism, the final blow over communism. And Joe Slovo, who was the head of the Communist Party, who was sort of the ideological leader within the movement, then said that we need to draw up a different strategy. Communism has been discredited. We, the ANC, should not portray ourselves as being communists. We should portray ourselves as being liberal. We should portray ourselves as the champions of liberal values. And they had a name for this.
That's what the left everywhere in the world is doing. They're portraying themselves as liberal while they're actually just communist or quasi-communist.
Yes, well, exactly. But they had a name for this strategy, and they called it the National Democratic Revolution. And basically what the National Democratic Revolution means is the organization has to pretend to be liberal, to get international support, to assure people in South Africa who are cautious of the ANC that no, they aren't that bad, so that they could get the power, so that they could become the government. And once they become the government, they can then use the state apparatus or the state mechanisms to further the goals of the revolution. And I mean, that's everything I said now about the National Democratic Revolution is written down in the ANC's own strategy and tactics document. So the end goal has always been stated that they want to move South Africa towards being a socialist state, but they want to have a particular strategy in achieving this.
Yeah, it's actually quite funny when I had that conversation with the youth leader of the EFF just last week, and I asked him. He said some things that I know of from the Communist Manifesto, and then I asked him, "Is he a communist?" And then he said, "No, he doesn't like labels." So I said to him, "Well, why do you use all these communist slogans, and why do you use all these communist ideas?" And then he told me, "Well, I'm not against communism. I'm for communism, but I'm not a communist.
Yeah.
I'm against labels." So I think that's a strategy that Malema and those guys, when they were at the ANC Youth League, still were taught that you are not communist, you are against labels, but you support communist narrative.
Yes, so I have every 2 weeks we publish an episode of Fact Sheet, a YouTube show. And I recently recorded one that we will publish soon, and it's about ideology, and it's about being careful about your own ideology. And one of the things I said there is that it links exactly to what you just said. The point is, nobody wants to be tied to an ideology. Everybody wants to claim to be non-ideological, but everybody is ideological. Everyone has ideological views, whether you know it or not. Whether you've read the Communist Manifesto, whether you've read The Wealth of Nations, whether you've read Frantz Fanon's, what's it called, Black Skins, White Masks, doesn't matter. Sometimes you might not have read anything about it. You still cling to a particular ideology, and you can know that just by asking yourself certain questions. For example, when you heard that Vicky Momberg was sent to prison for saying something racist, were you glad about that, or were you angry about that? So, and then some people might say, well, I despised racism, but I was still angry when I heard that she was sent to prison. That's because you have a particular frame of reference. Or you can say, in which world would you rather live in? Would you rather live in a world in which everyone is perfectly equal but not free? You aren't free, you can't do what you want to do, but everyone's equal. Or would you rather live in a world where there's massive inequality, but you are free to do what you want to do? Some people would choose the one option, other would choose the other. And that says a lot, whether you have read Das Kapital or whether you have read, as I said, Wealth of Nations or whatever. Just your answer to that question is already an indication of what your ideological view is.
Exactly. If you are going to put people on two sides of a line, you're either communist or you're not, or you're capitalist. But the most important question that I have for you today, Ernst, is when's Afriforum going to buy a helicopter?
Well, I think my answer to that question might surprise you, and that is that we're not planning on buying a helicopter. But
well, what about all the communists that require free helicopter rides?
No. What I can tell you is Afriforum has, I mean, that's not a secret. We have 210,000 members. We have more than 100 branches across the country. We are very strict in terms of our branches. So the total number fluctuates because if a branch is inactive, we close it down. But we keep establishing new branches all the time. But it's more important to have active branches than to have many branches. So we have around, let's say, 120 branches. And we have many, many members who own aeroplanes or helicopters. And we have been able to use that in many cases, especially, and that's part of the philosophy behind Afriforum is it's about community involvement. And I know me and you have had the discussion.
So you will involve the community in giving the commies free helicopter rides then?
No, we will not give them helicopter rides, but we do have the ability in terms of using, for example, helicopters to respond to farm attacks. And we have been doing that. I think we've been doing it to a much greater extent than people know.
I like how you are dodging my question so much by talking about something completely unrelated, but thanks, Ernst. I was just making a joke there.
That's fine.
Yeah. But tell me it looks like you guys have been working hard. I've noticed that you are sitting not at home this time. It's already after 8 and you're still sitting at work, I can see. So
yes, I'm at the office.
You guys have been working hard. What have you been doing yeah, I think it's because of this whole farm thing that you've been at work so late. But what have you been doing apart from calling the people and talking to them? Have you set up some kind of a strategy of what you guys are going to do next, or have you made some plans, or don't you want to
Yes,
tell us what your plans are?
well, the easy answer is to say what the minister has said, to say that we have a strategy, but it's a confidential strategy. We don't want people to know. No, we had a long workshop this afternoon with some people, which I cannot disclose now. We will disclose it soon, maybe in a few days, maybe in a week, of some interesting things that we will be doing in terms of the campaign against expropriation without compensation. We do have a few cards up our sleeve. I think that's going to have a major impact on the debate. And I would really love to devolve all of that to you now, but it hasn't been sorted out completely. So there's still some internal discussions that we need to go through. But we will be having a press conference soon, a joint press conference with some other people about a new initiative in terms of putting pressure on government regarding expropriation without compensation. And I do think, broadly, I think the overarching goal is we need to get people more involved. People have been very involved with the land reform hearings, or at least the expropriation without compensation hearings, to such an extent that I think we can pat ourselves on the back because I think we have achieved a big victory in that. It was in the Sunday papers now that the ANC has a problem. They had a big discussion at their recent National Executive Committee hearing because they have to concede that the vast majority of people who participated in the process have said that they don't want expropriation without compensation. Now, I'm not only talking about the public hearings, I'm talking about the written submissions as well. I think they had 700,000 submissions in total, of which 500,000 was against expropriation. And that's because of community involvement, of people writing letters, sending emails, going to meetings and so forth. But I think we cannot stop there. We need to have some form of protest, of visible protest action. And when I say visible protest action, I don't mean necessarily organizing a big protest march. That it could be that, but protesting is not our strong point. We need to see where are we really strong, what are the things in which we are good, what are the things that we can organize that will be most effective and have the lowest risk, and we really need to engage in that. And I think there are quite a few things that we can do, but we really need to make sure that it's not only people sitting at Afriforum's headquarters, it's not only you making videos on YouTube, it's not only people of political parties or whoever, that it must be members of public who must become involved in some way, in some form of visible or at least decisive protest action.
All right, and are you guys planning a specific protest action on a specific day, or not yet?
Yes, well, we aren't planning a protest march, although we are seriously considering that. We know, for example, sometimes organizing something like that is more dependent on something that happens in the news that sort of grabs the imagination of people. So we played a big role in the Black Monday events, but it really wasn't our initiative, and we certainly cannot take the praise for organizing it. We only organized some of the events, but it was largely sparked by some murders that were well reported in the media that really grabbed the imagination of people. And
that girl that made the video.
Yes, there were a few videos doing the rounds on social media, particularly that the farmer who is a friend of Hubert Conradi, who was murdered near Klapmuts in Stellenbosch. That video where he sat in the bakkie and he thought that he would just send it out to his 8 friends, and eventually it sparked a nationwide protest. So we need to be able to latch on to things like that. So I don't think it's as easy as saying, oh, let's organize a protest march next Saturday. But there are other things. I know people have been talking a lot about blocking up highways and things like that. Of course, that's not legal, but that is something that an individual can do that would have a major impact. And I'm not saying that we need to go and block highways. I'm saying that we need to think creatively about ways in which we can do this. And I'm deliberately being a bit vague because we are currently in discussions about a proposal in this regard. which we will, as I said, we will be announcing soon. But we still need to make sure that all the different role players are on board in terms of what it is that we want to do. And it is something that I think members of the public would be able to get involved in, or at least be able to state that they are interested in joining and becoming involved with this.
Why are you saying people getting involved? I see there are quite a few people watching from overseas, and they're asking if Afriforum will open a section for foreigners to become part of Afriforum to support us here.
That's a good question, and we have been discussing that. There are some issues about, and it's technical issues about becoming a member of Afriforum and signing a debit order and that type of thing. As we know, to become a member of Afriforum, you need to make a monthly contribution to the value of your choice. But we are certainly in the process of doing that. And I think if people who are abroad are interested, then they should send us an email. They should send an email to afriforum@afriforum.co.za and tell us that they want to become involved. The idea is to set up the proposal is to set up a type of a Friends of Afriforum network where people can also contribute to what Afriforum is doing. And we found that, I know there are people in South Africa who regard people who have left the country as traitors and stuff like that. But I think we must be careful to declare people as such. I think people who are abroad can be a very valuable asset for our cause in terms of raising awareness where they are. And we've seen that in Australia. It's been working very well in Australia in terms of people who left South Africa, who are now living in Australia, who played a massive role in putting pressure on the Australian media and the Australian government to take a stance on what's happening in South Africa. And we need to get South Africans, or not necessarily South Africans, people abroad who are interested in South Africa, in the USA, in Europe, in other countries as well, to be more outspoken. And we've seen that work. We've seen how the South African government reacted to the statement by Peter Dutton in Australia. And so the South African government and the ANC are very cautious of this. They don't want international criticism because they've been the international poster boys of freedom and peace for so long. And exactly. they like being on that pedestal.
And if we set up an international Friends of Afriforum, whatever you want to call it, we have to make John Bolton the leader of that.
Yeah, well, John Bolton is just downstairs. He's in our basement right now. He's doing some admin. So.
Oh, really? Is John Bolton helping you guys out now?
Yeah, he's doing some paperwork for us.
That's good.
He's working he's sitting in a cubicle across from Elvis Presley. I don't know if you know, Elvis isn't dead. He's been working for Afriforum. No, I'm joking now because I saw so many conspiracy theories about John Bolton and about whatnot. So I see some people are very creative in terms of the type of things that they make up.
And another thing that I really wanted to talk about, actually, before you actually released your list, and I wanted to get you on the show again, was I just made a documentary. I think you saw it about Urania.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. In any case, I've got some very, very positive responses on that documentary. Thousands of people actually sending me messages on Twitter and some emails and some messages on WhatsApp and stuff. So it seems like people are viewing the whole concept of self-determination as probably our only option in the long run in South Africa. Things go on as they do, and the communist ideology goes forth, and people get expropriated of their property and stuff like that. Can you tell us a bit about how Afriforum is what's betrokken, involved in a case for self-determination for the Afrikaner?
Well, I think self-determination is a very broad concept, but it is a very important concept. And I'm actually just trying to open a document on my computer as we're talking now. Just give me 1 second. Here we go.
I think we need to talk a lot more about it, because it's certainly in the back of the minds of not only my viewers, but a lot of Afrikaners, I think, especially with things going as they are going now in South Africa. I think a lot of people have self-determination in the back of their minds as our only option.
Well, I think in terms of that debate, I think what is important to know is there are many fallacies in South Africa, and I think the biggest fallacy is the white stole the land fallacy. But maybe the second biggest fallacy in South Africa, and that's a much more controversial thing to say, is that the concept of the South African Constitution isn't necessarily what people think it is. So one of the things, firstly, it's not the best constitution in the world. That's a fact. There are many problems with the South African Constitution, and I know some people will make a backflip when they just hear you say that because it's blasphemy. But one of the things that people need to know is, so in 1996, when the Constitution as we have it today, or as we know today, was adopted, it was declared the final Constitution. By academics and by politicians. People always spoke about, there was 1984? I can't remember, the old constitution that we had when we were still a parliamentary sovereignty. And then there was the interim constitution in 1993 that was basically set up to ensure the passover of power and the new government. And then the new government had to finalize the 1996 constitution, which was then referred to as the final constitution. In other words, now we have arrived, we will not have another constitution ever. And that's just false. So an interesting fact is, it's something that I've been doing research on in my own studies, but the average age of a constitution in the world is 19 years. So we know the American Constitution is 100 or 200 and something years old, but the average constitution in the world lasts only for about 19 years. Now, the South African Constitution has already surpassed that. The fact of the matter is, the chances of a constitution being adopted and then just being a final constitution is close to zero. So the point that I'm making is, whether we love the Constitution or whether we hate the Constitution, regardless of what your position on the Constitution is, the chances are that in our lifetime, that is not going to be the Constitution anymore. That's the overwhelming. That's the overwhelming odds that the Constitution would be replaced with something else, just because that's how the world works. And so we shouldn't simply look at the world and try to define our own existence and our own frame of reference within the text of the Constitution. Yes, we are protected for a lot of things in terms of the Constitution, and we should use that. But one of the things about the South African Constitution, which is also why it's praised as one of the best in the world, is the fact that it places a particular focus on individual rights. But it's not. The focus on individual rights is so much emphasized that it's become unrealistic. And the point that I'm making is that communities as such are becoming alienated under this constitution because there's no protection for communities, and communities are looking for different ways out. Or different ways of creating a future for themselves. Now, I'm not saying that our goal should be to break down the government, although I'm obviously not the biggest fan of government. The fact is, it's just a fact of life that things are going to change in future. And our involvement and how we prepare for that would have a big impact on how things would change and the extent to which we are prepared for that. And that then comes back to the issue of self-determination.
Okay, so what are we going to do to get to work towards self-determination if we are working towards that?
Well, there are different forms of self-determination, and you have to do different things in order to achieve the different forms of self-determination. So the best known form
about full self-determination, a full sovereign state for people. Yeah?
Yes, as for example, external self-determination versus internal self-determination, as it is known, but then you can also talk about territorial self-determination as opposed to corporate self-determination.
Well, the ANC will never allow corporate self-determination because that would be like apartheid but on steroids. So an example of corporate self-determination, it depends on how you define it. I probably think the external self-determination is about having a homeland for yourself. So secession, breaking away. Having your own country, that's external self-determination. And of course, I think for any community that's preferable, that's what they would want to do. And there's nothing wrong with saying, well, that's the ideal. But corporate self-determination, for example, is like the system that they have in Estonia and in some other countries where there's provision in legislation for communities to govern themselves within a particular country. So if you adhere to particular criteria, then you can comply to have a degree of legislative authority. So for example, to make it really practical, let's say there's a form of corporate self-determination for the Afrikaner people. What that would mean is if they comply with certain criteria, such as there's a certain amount of them, they feel a certain degree of solidarity among themselves as a community, they want to govern themselves, they adhere to some criteria, then what can happen
is they can vote internally within the country. They can have their own election and vote for a cultural council. And that cultural council would then have legislative powers. For example, they would have the ability to write their own laws, their own education laws for their own schools over which the government is not able to intervene. So that's a form of corporate self-determination. And that means that we stay within South Africa the way it is, but we are able to, there are certain institutions that are our own, and we can determine what they can do and what they cannot do.
Why don't we start openly working towards something like that as a first step then?
Yes, well, we were breaking up. You asked if we can work for something like that as a first step.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. Can we start doing that openly?
So that is what in Afrikaans the term is groeiende selfbeskikking, or growing self-determination boils down to. It's about different phases of obtaining self-determination. So the problem with this is, look, I don't want to be the pessimistic one. I mean, we need to find some sort of a solution. The big challenge with this is, I think this is something that we should be asking for, and it's possible within the framework of the South African Constitution. You can, and for those who are interested, they should look up Section 235 of the Constitution, which is the self-determination clause, but they should read that within the context of Section 185. So go and read Section 235 and then Section 185, and you compare those two, and you will see that within the framework of those two clauses, there is a possibility of a law being drawn up to provide for cultural councils or something to this effect. The catch, however, is that law has to be, the initial law at least, has to be accepted by government. So you need to get the ANC on board. You need to get the ANC to say, well, this isn't a bad idea, let's do it. So certainly they would not do this if we just ask them nicely. But if we can campaign for this, and we know the ANC has been talking about the balance of forces a lot, about that they need to consider what's happening in politics in South Africa, and that would influence their own policies. So you can influence them through the balance of forces by putting enough pressure on them to make certain concessions. And that is what happened in South Tyrol, where they moved from a situation where they weren't even allowed to have German names, the German minority community in the north of Italy. They had to change their names if their names were German. They had to change it to Italianize. It was a crime to go to a German school. That's where they were a few decades ago. And now they are at a position where they refer to themselves, or the government refers to them as an autonomous province. So that's another form of self-determination. In other words, the province is given as, the province is still part of Italy. It's Alto Adige is the name of the province, or they refer to it as South Tyrol. It's still part of Italy, but they can keep 90% of their tax money, and they can spend, in other words, 90% of their tax money on whatever they think they should be spending it on. So that's another form of self-determination. So when we talk about self-determination, it's not simply secession or chopping the country up. I think there are many forms, and I think if that is what that we want to achieve, then we should look at the different forms of self-determination and see which ones are most realistic and how can we achieve that.
Do you think it's realistic for us to start talking to people, to foreign people about this, and asking for support for us to establish a corporate self-determination? Is Afriforum already doing that? And also, I noticed that you have now an alliance with the Zulu King. Is this also linked to some sort of future self-determination talks? Yeah,
well, maybe just a comment on the Zulu King. So when we spoke with Goodwill Zwelithini, some of the criticisms about us meeting with Zwelithini is very telling about, again, the ideological narrative in South Africa at the moment. So I heard one very prominent Sunday paper, they posted on social media that this is a massive risk for Afriforum. How can they meet with the Zulu King and read our paper tomorrow, and we will explain to you why this is it could potentially be a massive blunder for Afriforum, the fact that they are working together. And I was very interested to read what are the risks. Why shouldn't we do it? And
so you went ahead and bought the paper.
Yes, I bought the paper. But the criticism boiled down to a very, very liberal, or I should say a new liberal frame of reference of how the world should work. So the criticism was the Zulu King has a different perception of property rights than Afriforum. Our view of how property rights should work is different from the Zulu King. So how can we work together? And the answer, if you just broaden your perspective a little bit, is very easy. We don't expect of other people, and we don't expect of other cultures to share our views. We don't expect of other cultures to want the world to operate in the same way that we want it to operate. We want different communities, and different cultural communities in particular, to be able to do things in the way in which they prefer. So if it's part, I'm not saying it is, but if it is part of Zulu tradition, that they want to have communal land, they want to have a king, and they want to live on the king's land, then that's their right. Then their culture should be respected. And if it's our culture to want to have title deeds, then that should also be respected. So, so the criticism, how can you work with the Zulu king because they have different norms than you do? I think it's very short-sighted. But yes, so I think the point that you wanted to make was that the Zulu king or the Zulus in general have their own perception or perspective on self-determination, and they regard that as important. They regard their identity as important, and it's something that they feel should be protected. And I think what we should be doing, and I know it's a source of frustration to some looking at what's happening in politics, and especially that we have a very prominent Zulu in South Africa who's not anyone's favorite politician, and he's not the king. He's a former president. But the fact of the matter is, we should really work to be making more friends than enemies. If someone is not necessarily your enemy, you shouldn't want to work to make that person your enemy. Or put different, if someone isn't your friend, you shouldn't make that person your enemy. And so I think, for example, there's a lot of things that Afrikaners as a community can cooperate with or work together with Zulus as a community, or with Sothos as a community, or Pedis, or Swazis. We weren't there, but there was a meeting. Some organizations met with the Swazi king recently, and I heard that it was a very fruitful meeting, because there's a mutual recognition and respect for each other's cultures, and we want the same thing at the end of the day. And that is not, we want property rights, we want private property to be dealt with in the same way. We want our cultures to be protected, and if we can find common ground on that, I think we will be able to make friends where we maybe didn't know that we could have friends, and we would be able to work together. And I think also it would break down the negative, it would break down the stereotypes that this is just some, Afrikaners just want to work with white people. I think there's a lot of things that Afrikaners can work together on with black communities like the Zulus and the Zulu King, for example.
Okay, so it is some sort that you guys are looking in the long run to make allies with the black tribes in order to establish self-determination. Then can we say that, or is that
I think Professor Karel Boshoff, who founded Orania, had a saying. He said that we want a future in South Africa if it's at all possible. If it's not possible to have a future in South Africa, then we need to create a future outside of South Africa. So in other words, in Afrikaans, it was binne in Suid-Afrika as dit kan, buite Suid-Afrika as dit moet. And I think what Afriforum is working for is to create a future inside South Africa, to try to address the current realities, and to try to make South Africa and the existing order something in which people can live. But we should not be naive and put all our eggs in one basket.
Do you think it's possible to make the current order as it is right now, the so-called democracy, or whatever you want to call this communist state that we live in now, is it possible for us to make that a reality, or can we just sweep that off the table right now and say, listen, this is never going to work. We might as well work towards another goal.
Yeah, I don't think that we should sweep it off the table, but I seriously don't think that we should be naive about what's happening in South Africa. And again, this might sound like blasphemy to some, but the problem is not simply that we have a good legal framework and that we just have the wrong party in government. The problem is the way in which the system is structured. For example, the fact that so much power is given to the state president to appoint people, and if the state president wants to control everything, the state president can pretty much do that within the framework of the law, in terms of appointing the head of private prosecutions, in terms of appointing the public protector, in terms of appointing the head of the constitutional court, and so forth. I read somewhere a list of all the people who could be appointed by the president. I can't remember the total, but it was a flabbergasting number. It was like 100 or something. I can't remember, but a very high number. Individual or at least influential people, positions who are appointed by the state president. And so once again, as I said, as I have said earlier, the highest authority in the land is not the South African Constitution. The highest authority in the land, despite the fact that the Constitution claims to be the highest authority, the highest authority is whoever interprets the Constitution, who is provided with the power to say, for example, when the Constitution says we can expropriate when it's in the public interest, someone has to interpret that and say, exactly. Well, when they say public interest, this is what it means. So if you ask me,
our constitution is so full of contradictions, like, for example, the hate speech bill or the freedom of speech. We don't really have any freedom of speech because it says you have freedom of speech except in cases of hate speech. And how can you have freedom of speech then? Because then the only thing that really is freedom of speech is whoever is in control interprets as not being hate speech.
Exactly.
Almost all of our rights are like that. It's not like the American Constitution, for example, that says that government is not allowed to ever intervene in the free press or someone else's speech, or even self-governing militias and the right to bear arms, where we have our Constitution. Every single one of our rights, it says you have this right except in cases when we don't want you to have this right, to put it very simple.
Yes. So for example, you have the right to human dignity and you have the right to freedom of speech. So where's the balance between human dignity and freedom of speech? What can you say? To what extent can you say what you want that would violate people's human dignity? And that's why there are courts. So the courts have to decide, well, this is how we interpret this.
And I think the president appoints all of these judges to the courts.
Yes, well,
all of them are political.
There's a Judicial Service Commission that appoints the judges, but the majority of people on the Judicial Service Commission are politicians. One of the people on the Judicial Service Commission is Julius Malema, who is on the committee that appoints judges in South Africa. Of course, there are other political parties as well, but the process is dominated by politicians. So to give you an example, I think one of the worst, if not the worst judgment since the adoption of the new constitution was the Tshwane street name case. And you should really read, well, I don't even want to say to people that they should read the judgment, because the judgment is so far removed from what was actually argued in court. And it's an important example. Let me just explain the example and then you'll understand why I'm saying it's important. So Afriforum was a party to that case, and it was the case about the changing of 27 of the street names in Pretoria. And the matter was about the fact that the local government did not follow the procedures. They changed the street names through an illegal process. And if the process is illegal, then the decision is illegal. That's the legal principle. And that's what we took to court. And we were very clear to say it's not simply about the fact that we don't like the names. That's not what it's about. It's about the process. And then if you read the judgment, it seems like we argued that. And that's actually what the Chief Justice said. He said, yeah, Afriforum's problem is just that they don't want to see black people's names on street signs, which is exactly the opposite to what we argued. That's what the Chief Justice found. And his conclusion was that this shouldn't be done because Afriforum is basing their argument on their right to protect their culture. And we must remember that Afrikaners did horrible, evil things in South Africa. Therefore, Afrikaners do not have a right to have their culture protected. You can go and read the judgment. And then I think it was Judge Cameron who wrote a dissenting judgment or a minority judgment. And he said, I cannot agree with this judgment, because what the Chief Justice has just written or found was, he said that where the Constitution says the rights of linguistic and cultural communities has to be protected, effectively, this judgment means that we should add the words at the end of that clause to say the rights of cultural and linguistic communities must be protected except for Afrikaners. That's basically the position of the Constitutional Court. And it sounds atrocious, but you could go and read the judgment. So that's why I'm saying that it's not simply saying the Constitution. You need to look farther than that. But I think one other thing about the current system not being sustainable is, and that's the problem with democracy. And I think I've spoken to you about this last time we spoke, but that famous Churchill saying that democracy is the worst form of government, but it's better than the ones we have tried. And I know you have a view on that, but the fact of the matter is democracy is a system of supply and demand. So there has to be a demand from the people for a good, accountable government, and there has to be a supply from some political party to say we are going to be an accountable government.
Yeah, I would love to one day have a Oxford style debate with you on whether democracy is the best form of government or not.
Yeah,
I'll argue for traditional monarchy, and you can argue for democracy, and then
I'm going to have a hard time arguing for democracy.
We can have the people decide who they think are all right.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that democracy is the best form of government. I know that
what would you think is?
There are many flaws with democracy, but I'm still not convinced what the best form of government is. The main flaw with there's been studies about this, that democracy is particularly ineffective in poor countries, and it sounds horrible, but there's a logical reason for that, and that is, in a poor country where there's a massive unemployment rate, people who are poor and unemployed would much easier be convinced by a socialist government to vote for them. So one party would say, vote for us because we are a party of entrepreneurship. You have to work hard to create a better future for yourself. And if you want to be prosperous, you need to study and work hard, and that's how we're going to do things. And the other party is saying, vote for us, we're going to give you free stuff. Which party is going to win the election? And well, I think that's the problem, particularly in South Africa.
That is definitely true, but the other thing is that being poor or being rich is a very relative concept. If you give every single person on earth $1 million right now, then nobody is going to be rich, because there's nothing that you can't be rich. You can only be richer than somebody else.
Yeah.
You can't, because if let's say, for example, every person in the world has $1 million, then you say everyone can buy himself a Ferrari, which is not true, because then Ferrari would just move their prices up to make only the rich or the relatively rich people buy a Ferrari. So it doesn't matter how poor or how rich you are in a country, there are always going to be a 7% and a 93%, as Ron Paul says. And you are always, in every democracy, you are always going to be able to convince at least a majority within the 93% that you will give them whatever the 7% have. And those people in that 93% won't be able to know that if you divide the 7% richest between them, they're not going to be very rich, but you can still convince them of that. And that's what happened in every single country that had a democracy thus far. If we start with Athena, because democracy has for very long been known as the failed Athenian experiment. But if you start with them, for example, and you take it all the way to Sweden, Sweden or Britain, one of those two are going to be the next democracy to fail, in my opinion. It's always the same story. It's always somebody convincing the relatively have-nots that they will give them everything that the relative haves do have. And I don't think that you can ever change that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you are completely right about, for example, everyone being rich or everyone having $1 million, and then what would the price of a Ferrari be? Because that's in essence how a free market works, is it's supply and demand, and the price is determined by equilibrium. So there where supply and demand meets, that's what the appropriate price should be. So if the richer people get, the higher the prices would be for a Ferrari, for example. But it depends on supply and demand. That's the thing. But I think the appropriate stance on inequality, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've been asking a lot of people for their views on inequality, because I'm still not completely certain, or at least not inequality, equality as such. I'm still not certain what the appropriate stance should be. I don't think anybody wants to be against equality.
Why would you be for equality? I mean, equality is impossible. It's unnatural. Nobody is equal to anyone else. I mean, the same person isn't even equal to himself.
That's the point. So the question is, if you are in favor of equality, what type of equality are you in favor of? So are you saying you are in favor of equality of income? I'm certainly not, although it sounds wonderful, but I know what the consequences of that would be, or I know what has to be done in order for equality of income to be achieved. That's communism. That's what Mao Zedong tried, and that's what Joseph Stalin tried, or equality of outcome, so to speak. I think equality of outcome is an atrocious concept. So if you're not for equality of outcome, are you for equal opportunities? I would tend to think that I am for equal opportunities. I want everyone to have the same opportunities.
But
it becomes
equality of opportunity possible? Because if you say you're for equality of opportunity, then it means that everyone needs to start on a clean slate and have equal opportunities. That means a person out of a millionaire family should somehow be forced to have the same opportunities as someone.
That's exactly the point. So my first inclination is to say I'm very much in favor of equal opportunities. But if you really look at it practically, people, and that's the unfortunate thing, is people don't have equal opportunities, and that's where privilege comes in. And it's not white privilege. I think it's the privilege of having grown up in a family in which you were taught certain values, or in which you were taught a particular worldview. So if your parents keep telling you that everything that is wrong with you should be blamed on someone else, or let's say there are two hypothetical families, each of them with one child. The one family keeps telling their child that everything is everyone else's fault. The other family keeps telling their child to toughen up and to solve his or her own problems. Which one would be more, which one's chance of succeeding would be higher? I mean, there's no dispute about that. So those two children, unfortunately, don't have equal opportunities because of the way in which they were taught. So it really becomes difficult. I think it's equality is a massive buzzword, and again, if you ask me, am I in favor of equality? I would say yes, but it really becomes complicated if you look at it. Then I think, and I don't want to go into a theological debate. You are the talk-a-lock between us, but then the question, then I would maybe ask, well, are we all equal before God? And I would say yes, we are. But well, then you open up an entire theological.
You were a Calvinist, Ernst.
Sorry?
I thought you were a Calvinist, and now you say we are all equal before God.
Well, I mean, that's the point. So we can say yes, we are.
That's the most anti-Calvinist argument I've ever heard.
Well, that's the point. Is it's not even that simple, because we are equal because we are all sinners, and I'm speaking philosophically now. We are equal because we are all sinners, but we aren't equal because if you read at least the way the Bible's written, that's just that's not at least my reading of the Bible, that God views everyone as equal. And I mean, it's philosophical, but the point is, I'm trying to figure out which form of equality do I think is the appropriate form.
How about no form of equality? How about just having a natural hierarchy as nature intended?
No, perhaps equal dignity. I think people's dignity should be protected equally. Well, then you can ask the question, what about criminals? Should they have the same? Should their right to human dignity be protected to the same extent? So it becomes very complicated. But I think maybe just to close on that, in terms of my view, is there's a book written recently by Walter Scheidel, The Great Leveler, and he particularly looked at inequality and which forms of government has been effective at addressing inequality. And for example, Cuba is basically a communist state, but people don't know that under Fidel Castro, the great communist dictator or the great communist leader, depending on what you think of him, inequality increased in Cuba.
Of course. The worst off you ever want to be in a socialist country is someone who is not friends with whoever is in charge.
Yes, that's exactly the point. But so what Walter Scheidel found was that no one really knows how to solve inequality. There's no difference between right-wing governments and left-wing governments. They still have the same inequality. It increases and decreases. He found that the only way to really address that is basically, or the only things that could happen to solve inequality are things like natural disasters, things like world wars. Those type of things make people equal. And none of those things, I think there were 4 things he found. None of those things are things that we really want. So the point of the fact of the matter is, inequality is a fact of life. It's been a fact of life since since the agricultural revolution, when people were able to gather wealth, when people were able to inherit wealth. Since that first day that happened, inequality was a reality.
I would say before that, even I would say it was a reality from the start, because even before the agricultural revolution happened, there were a lot of inequalities between people. You can simply say the one caveman who is physically stronger than the other caveman will
That's a
always be
form of
better off
inequality.
than the weaker one, because he would be able to, you know, catch more wives and more wildlife.
Yeah. So my view on this might develop over time, but at this stage, my position is I'm very much in favor of equality, but I can't figure out which form of equality we really want to achieve. Number one, and number two is based on the evidence, mankind or humankind doesn't know how to make people equal. Not even communist dictators have succeeded in making people equal. They've only shifted the wealth from one group to another group. So I think that's the overarching problem here.
Ernst, we've been going on for well over an hour now, and I think we're going into highly philosophical stuff now.
Yeah.
It might be unwise to continue with that. Otherwise, we could be talking until tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
But in any case, thank you very much for coming onto the show, and I really appreciate you talking about the farms that are on the list, and I hope that we can that we can use this information to be better off and to prevent anything disastrous from happening. In any case, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it every time that you come on.
Thank you, Willem. It's a privilege to be on the show, and again, thank you for everything that you are doing in terms of raising awareness. It's good to be able to work together.
Thank you very much, Ernst, and
Great.
thank you for everyone who was watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.